Hey everyone, my name is Nelson Miller. I'd like to share some encouragement with you. Recently, I heard a story of a friend who had a decision to make for his family. And this decision actually was related to something happening at their church. And so, after a lot of prayer and consideration and, mature, wise counsel, the family made their decision. The problem was that the decision actually took a stance against what some of the church leadership wanted. And this obviously caused some backlash, and actually it caused some both private and public backlash. And the things that were used against this family were things like manipulation, coercion, sarcasm, condemnation, shame, and of course control. Now all of these were subtle. They were not, outright attacks, but they were subtle tactics used against this family. Keep in mind the family knew that their decision was the right thing to do and what God wanted them to do. So what do we do in a situation like this? So we see ways and hear voices all the time. So I want to just encourage us to think about God's ways and recognize God's voices. So I hope it's pretty clear, but those things shouldn't be happening in a church. Those are not of God's church, the things I mentioned. So we need to recognize that as the enemy. Manipulation, coercion, even sarcasm, certainly condemnation, shame, control, those are not of God. Those are not of God, and they're not of God's church. When we see that, we need to recognize it as the enemy. And so we may be a little uneasy about that. If those things are coming from church leadership, that feels a little weird. But we have to remember, the enemy is a specialist. The enemy is an expert at deception. The truth will set you free. We'll talk more about that in the future, but for today, let's keep a couple things in mind. There's one thing in particular that I want to say that I've learned. When you hear these things and see these things, recognize that person that's doing or saying those things is not the enemy. That will really help you. Just take it from my experience. The person doing or saying those things is not the enemy. As you learn to recognize God's ways and see God's ways, how He works, you actually will become really clear on the ways of the enemy. It will just be obvious. As you learn to hear God's voice, as He talks to you, perhaps daily, and just tells you things, it will be really obvious to you when the enemy is speaking. The most important thing here is to recognize who we are. So I started something called God's Imagers. It's a podcast. We have worship nights, and we're going to have a lot more teaching in the future. But that concept of being an image bearer of God, a representative of God, that's an identity that is really powerful. You have the family name of God. You have His authority, His power, His blessing, and His love. And so when you respond to situations like this that are coming from the enemy, and again, not the person, but the enemy behind that, this is how you can respond. You can respond with that authority as a representative of Yahweh. You have authority, you have power, you have His love, you have His blessing. You're bearing His name. Everything you do is ordained by Him. You're His child. You're in His family. You are like the firstborn representative. You can do his business here on earth. So I encourage you with that. I encourage you to be an image bearer of God. You're his beloved. That will change your life. So when these situations do come, when you see the enemy working, again, as you learn to recognize God's ways, his voice, who you are, the enemy loses everything. The enemy loses his ability to deceive and manipulate and coerce and shame you and condemn you and control you. So I bless you with that. This is something I do plan to do in the future. I'm not sure how often, but I have some stories to share. Some stories that have happened in my life and also in a web of interconnected lives over the past year specifically and over the past years in general. Some incredible stories that God has been telling me to share them for a long time, and now it's time. I'm not sure when they'll actually be released, but I'm going to be putting them on my God's Imagers YouTube channel and probably also have some podcast episodes about it. Some incredible stories, people you know, and just the way God has worked, incredible things. And so I want to share them with you, but I also want to be a blessing and an encouragement. So as you go, just remember, you are God's beloved.